In order to understand print media in its entirety, we must first understand the importance of print media throughout history. Various forms of print media, from newspapers to novels, serve to represent historical time periods, not only in the way that they document important events, but in the way that they capture the thoughts and feelings of the population of a time. For example, to the right we see Thomas Paine's Common Sense, a persuasive piece written in 1775 that advocated independence from Great Britain to people in the colonies. And further to the right, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, a document signed in 1848 by 62 women and 38 men at the first Women's Rights Convention organized by women. Both of these documents played a crucial role in making movements and passing laws that changed history forever. In examining the ways in which history is represented in print media, we can begin to understand print media as an outlet for documentation and expression. When one wants to learn about any historical event, from genocides to revolutions to wars, the second best resource to directly communicating with a survivor, bystander, or participant of the time is a first-hand account documented in print media. Here we see the memoir Night and the novel The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, each of which captured the time of the Holocaust, continuing the conversation of the tragedy that it was. To the right, we see one book aimed towards children to better their understanding of the American Revolution, and Red at Heart, a novel detailing Chinese communist ties to the Russian Revolution. Libraries are dedicated to safeholding print media so that these resources, and arguably history itself, is never lost. While writing occurs as an outlet for many to document their lives, sharing these stories through print media can bring awareness to issues that have been previously overlooked, inspire others to speak up, and create movements of change. Listen to what Elie Wiesel has to say regarding his memoir Night, about he and his father's time in and out of concentration camps during World War II.
The world has not stopped at night. The world continued. It is true that something stopped. Some lives were broken. It is true that some worlds were crushed, shattered. Some idols disappeared, vanished. Some suns were extinguished. But life does continue. If not, what would we do here? If not, the testimony itself would be stifled by the curse, by the cursed universe it conjured. So continue to read other books. Some of them are supposed to bring joy, not despair. Others are supposed or are meant to open gates towards love, towards truth, towards happiness, towards friendship, towards faith. Do not see in night as a prison which is sealed from within 7 times. Night is a foundation to say, look, this is what happened. Can we continue? Even if the answer is no, I would say we must continue. We must invoke a meaning even when there is no meaning. We must formulate a prayer for hope even if there is no hope.
As you can see, Night was only the beginning of a movement that inspired other survivors to come forward and share their stories, and continues to serve as a way for teachers to impart history and literature on their students through a compelling text. Print media may begin by documenting events, but the beauty of it lies in its endless possibilities to teach, inspire, and create change. From its origins in Germany to its transition over to America, the newspaper has always played a crucial role in delivering the most relevant, factual news, oftentimes with a controversial opinion piece sprinkled in. With news so readily available via television and smartphone nowadays, it's hard to believe the only source of important news was once the newspaper. However, the fact goes to show that why the demand for newspapers was so high. According to a source entitled A Brief History of Newspapers by Phil Barber, Articles and papers brilliantly conceived by revolutionary propagandists were a major force that influenced public opinion in America from reconciliation with England to full political independence. Then, the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791 at last guaranteed freedom of the press, and America's newspapers began to take on a central role in national affairs. In other words, journalists and your everyday civilian alike were beginning to realize the impact of print media and relishing in the opportunity to make a change by speaking your mind. According to Phil Barber, during the Civil War, the unprecedented demand for timely, accurate news reporting transformed American journalism into a dynamic, hard-hitting force in the national life. Reporters, called specials, became the darlings of the public and the idols of youngsters everywhere. However, author Eliza Richards calls into question the authenticity and timelessness of Civil War literature, aside from just newspaper documentations, in her journal article entitled U.S. Civil War Print Culture and Popular Imagination. She begs the questions of, how do we evaluate white representations, both Northern and Southern, of Black experience, and where can we find authentic representations of African American wartime experience? Richards proves that the literature of a time can impress upon society a certain way of thinking. For instance, she represents the findings of scholar Daniel Aaron. Looking back upon the personal narratives and literature of both Northern and Southern writers during the Civil War, it is clear that the American people were in a state of denial about the monstrosity and evil that was slavery. In a paper entitled A Tract in Fiction, Women's Suffrage Literature and the Struggle for the Vote, author Claire Delahaye examines the ways in which the women advocating for women's suffrage used literature and print media to make their case and conjure up support. These women used short stories, novels, poetry, etc., as a political tool to expand the market of literature written by women for women that helped the suffragist movement to gain momentum and ultimately gain women our rights. Several texts during the movement were crucial in helping the movement to gain traction due to their wit and expression of women's power in politics. In the words of Delahaye, the spreading of suffragist ideas through fiction is a testimony to the progressive faith in the power of print and the belief in the power of fiction to transform society. The collection of print media produced during World War I is to this day the largest collection of propaganda and literature out of any war. What is unique about World War I is the trench poets, soldiers themselves actually writing from the trenches during the time of war. In an article entitled Poetry in World War I, author C.N. Truman describes how soldiers resorted to poetry during this time because the nature of poetry is metaphorical and begs one to interpret the diction. This was crucial to the soldiers as they could not write home with any accuracy of their current condition in fear of getting in trouble. Listen to what Dr. Daw has to say about World War I poetry, its impact, and why we continue to read it.
100 years after the conflict, with more men and women getting killed daily in military action, I don't think that these poems will suddenly kind of help us to stop war. And we read these poems again and again, not because they satisfy some urgent kind of political need, or that suddenly they'll turn the world into a pacifist one, but rather that in their combination of protest, anger, moral complexity, and linguistic pleasure, they make us realize how complex we are, at once idealistic, thoughtful, mortal, guilty, and make us understand once more what it is to be human. And I think this is the lasting contribution of the poetry of the First World War, not to push a neat moral or political agenda, but rather to make us think and critically reflect, all through the sensuous spell of language.
If anything goes to show the power of words throughout history, it is the fact that many books were momentarily banned from public consumption for a number of reasons. For example, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye was banned for explicit sexual content and a rebellious protagonist, who parents fear their children turning into if they picked up the book. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God was banned for instances of sexual assault and murder, and challenged for airing out issues within the Black community. Interestingly enough, both of these novels are taught in high schools today, after once being banned from the public completely. This goes to show how the literature a society is reading or unable to read represents society itself and its progression. In an article entitled The Subsiding Sizzle, A Descriptive History of Print Advertising from 1900 to 1980, author Richard Pillay examines print advertising by providing a decade-by-decade analysis. The ways in which print media adapted over 80 years to be responsive to the times and mold to changing and evolving societies proves that print media always adapts to the population receiving it. As technology evolves and news is available in countless formats, it is important to remember that history as we know it is preserved because of print media, and also to remember that this so-called history consists not only of important events, but of the thoughts and feelings of the society experiencing these events during these times. In the words of Pillay, the birth of electronic media, of radio and television, supplemented rather than displaced print media.